All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of the Enablement Brew. I'm Carly Lehner.
And I'm Malvina el-sayegh, and we are so excited you're joining us for episode 3. And on today's episode, we are talking about one of the necessary evils, as I like to call it, in enablement, which is the concept of a charter. Do we need one? Do we not need one? What are some of the best practices? And how do you actually tackle putting together something that outlines what enablement does? On the last episode, we talked about misconceptions. So Carly and I felt that this flows very nicely into the topic of a charter. So let's kickstart things off. But before we do, I got my coffee. Carly, what do you have?
I got tea today and a very uninspiring mug, just a basic white Amazon mug.
So. Yeah, I did the kids drop off this morning. So one to nursery, one to school. And then on the way, I decided to pick up a coffee, and it was literally like Mount Vesuvius. I could not drink it. So 2 hours later, it is now at a nice drinking temperature. I literally burned my tongue this morning on this coffee.
I was trying to figure out what you meant by Mount Vesuvius. Like, did it like explode? Like, what are we talking here? Temperature. So that makes sense.
It wasn't even hot. It was boiling, you know, like I literally took a sip of it and I still feel my tongue sore from the coffee. But anyway, good to go.
Awesome. All right. So let's talk charter or no charter. Have you ever written a charter, Malvina, for enablement?
So, the correct answer to this question should be, yes, I have. I have outlined everything very nicely. The truth is, yes. Would I call it a charter as such? Well, yes, to some extent, but probably not what a lot of the books out there preach, at least to the extent and depth of what an enablement charter is. And I mean, here I'm going by my favorite book, which I have right by my side. Ah, you have it too. How funny.
I literally tell everyone who wants to get into enablement, buy this book.
Yes.
Schenk. I just love her.
Byron, absolutely. So this is kind of the Bible, I would say, for enablement, right? Like a lot of the best practices, a lot of the questions that we have specifically around charter, it is written so beautifully here. So what I tend to do actually with this book in particular, if I'm putting together some sort of an outline, some form of a charter that at least gives the organization a good overview of what enablement does, how it collaborates with other departments, I will go to this book, literally to the back pages where you have the
example.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I will kind of, check what I'm putting down on paper versus the best practices in this book. So I love this one.
Me too. I've done 2 charters. I've been head of enablement at 2 companies. So the first one I did wasn't like what the Bible preaches, but it was helpful just to showcase like who the audience is for enablement. And at my previous company, like we really had to do that because there was really only 2 of us, and one was a junior enablement resource and one was myself. And we couldn't realistically support in all aspects of enablement all 150 people in the revenue team. We called it the commercial team there. So we really had to specify, like, we are supporting BDRs, account executives, and sales leaders. Like, we'd love to support like the client success team, but we don't have the team to do that. So supporting, showing who you're supporting is super important from a charter perspective. And then also like what our spend was and, things like that. But at Andela, what I basically just copied this appendix and just filled in the blanks. And I found that to be a really helpful exercise. And in fact, I share it with my new hires when they join the enablement team, so they know like the direction we're going in. But I'm actually really happy to say that we've accomplished a lot from our charter for the year. like already, and we're just starting Q4. So I need to like start thinking about what does 2022 look like? Because 2021 was all about foundation building, and we've actually done a really good job with that. So now it's like, okay, I probably need to write a whole another one of these for the next year. So,
right?
Yeah.
And if we look at the enablement charter here that we have in the appendix, I mean, as you've mentioned, even using this as a template and then filling it in is so much, it's easier, right, than starting one absolutely from scratch, because then you're potentially thinking, okay, strategy, mission, vision, right? What are our key objectives? Who are we supporting? But this just lays it out in such a good format that one consolidates a lot of the time investment, because these things, it's not something that you can just sit down and write in an hour.
No.
I mean, you probably could, good, right? You need to dedicate some time and actually put, some thoughts to use here. But what I would say actually before writing an enablement charter and before you put the pen to paper is sit down with the leadership team. If you're working very closely with co-founders or CEOs, sit down with them, because the first step to writing that enablement charter is really understanding what is the mission, the vision, and the strategy, right, for the upcoming 12 months, because ultimately we as enablers, we're supporting whatever it is that the company is going after. So having that clear view of the strategy and then saying, okay, great, if this is where we want to get to in 12 months, this is where enablement can help. And I think before we even sit down, start writing, having that conversation is so key. And to add to that, because enablement has such different meanings in different organizations, you can go from one startup to another scale up to another company. And ultimately, the understanding of what enablement is differs so vastly, right? For some people, enablement will also be operations, right? Potentially. And I think it's also understanding, what is that understanding from their side? What are some of the things that you need to clarify before you start writing it down?
Yeah. So one of the things that I can't remember if it's in the charter template or not, is even saying like what's out of scope of the enablement team, and pretty clearly defining marketing will be creating case studies. So like address one of the misconceptions of enablement that we talked about in our previous episode that might exist in your organization. Address that in your charter and say like, this is not something that is enablement's responsibility. And if it is, make sure we have the funding for that, whether that's through headcount, technology, resources, those sort of things. So don't sign yourself up for something if you're not prepared to take it on, given, resource constraints and those sort of things. But Malvina, what would you say is like the hardest part about having a charter? Like this is always like a topic at like enablement conferences, and like you should always write a charter, but why do we think people don't do it?
I think there is a few reasons to that. I think the first one is it is time consuming, right? And oftentimes when you join an organization, we are all in this mindset of let's start, right? Let's make an impact. What are the low hanging fruit? What can we go after? And I think, and I know this happens to me as well, right? You get so caught up in actually already trying to make an impact, already trying to make the difference, that you're like, oh, okay, the charter will come. The charter will come. I just don't have the time to write it out. I think also the other part of it, and I'm curious to hear what you say, is I think we as enablement leaders, as enablement as a whole, have to be very nimble. We have to be able to adjust to our surroundings. And sometimes I feel having a charter like this, as good as it is, could be a bit constraining, right? Because you've put it on paper, but suddenly there is a different need that has arisen within the organization. You want to act, but hey, it's not documented here. What do I do? Do I do it? Do I not do it? So time, and because it could put constraints that potentially you don't want, especially if you're working at a scale up where things are changing very quickly. I would love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think time for sure. It can take a while to fill one of these out. And also just maybe not knowing where to get started. So like for me, when I wrote my first charter, I was like, I don't really think this is exactly what I should be doing, but at least I'll start somewhere. So definitely, you know, buy the book, it'll help you. But if you want to go from, there's like different levels of enablement maturity, right? There's like, I can't remember. There's, I think 4 that we talk about in this book here. There's like informal, formal, and like maybe mature or something like that. And a lot of enablement teams are small. They're like one enablement person. They're super informal, and it's a very much a reactionary service provided to the revenue team. And so it's really hard to train the revenue team to not think of enablement as like this reactionary support organization, as opposed to a forward thinking, proactive function that can help the team scale and grow and meet its goals. A lot of companies treat enablement like, hey, like we need a training on this, build it for us, or the pitch deck needs to be updated, do this for us. It's all very like reactionary, project-based, short-term types of work. And so if you're the only enablement person, it can be really difficult to like remove yourself, find the time in your day to remove yourself from that and think about how enablement could be really proactive. So I know like for me, I was doing enablement for 1.5 years at my previous company, and there was really no rhyme or reason to what we were doing. It was just like, oh, like this is the need right now, like very reactionary. And so when I stepped into the head of role, it's like, okay, I think I need to create a charter, because like I can't continue to operate this way because it feels like we're not really making that much of an impact. So defining what metrics for success look like, which I think is also probably one of our topics for episodes, I think is really important to then be able to come back and show like what enablement's been doing, and how it's contributed to the growth of the organization. But I think a lot of it has to do with like solo practitioners out there, and there's so many of them. So if you're going to be the first hire in enablement, I would say like just go on a listening tour, kind of like you said, Malvina, of like loop in leaders and kind of understand the state of the union, build a charter, and then go from there. I think also different times of year are a good point in time to like pull up and write one. So end of quarters is always a really good time, end of the year, that sort of thing. So I think it's always important to like revisit your charter, which is something we can talk about. How often should you do that? But if you don't have one, use like end of quarter as a great time to like reset going into the new quarter fresh, or the new year fresh. But yeah, charters are, they're probably the toughest part about enablement, is just like documenting what you want to be doing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right? It's difficult stepping into a new role where potentially you are that first enablement hire. You're not going to be able to write that enablement charter in the first week that you join. I mean, that would be ludicrous. I have no idea what's going on. You don't fully understand what the challenges are. You don't fully understand what are the current capabilities, right? You know, what are the things that we've tried up until this point before enablement joined? Because let's face it, a lot of these things and activities that we are going to be so vocal about, right? They could have already tried them in the past. We want to understand what's worked, what's not worked, and where we are ultimately going to have that difference. So I would completely say not something you're going to be writing in the first, second, third week, even as you join an organization, because you want to gain that understanding. And I always say the first 30 days in any organization is getting the lay of the land, right? You want to understand. It's almost like you're drawing your map and trying to connect all the dots. Once you have that clear, I would say that's when you start writing the enablement charter. And look, if you want to make it as detailed as it is in this book, awesome. But if you're just starting off and there's a lot of things being thrown at you in the beginning that you do want to tackle because they are going to make an impact, at least start with a skeleton. And an enablement charter is not something you write once, right? You don't write it once and forget about it. As you've mentioned, you are going to be revisiting it. So don't feel the pressure, I would say, to have everything ready and, you know, seal the envelope, it's done. Put the skeleton in there, right? Put the structure, write down really the key things that are coming and that you're hearing, at least around the vision and mission for enablement. I think that's key, right? You need to understand what is that vision, what is that mission, and then start putting in everything else bit by bit. Is there any other book apart from this one that you kind of go back to as inspiration?
Honestly, like this is the only enablement book I have in hard copy. I do have like a book on how to write playbooks. But this one is really the only one. And I've obviously like bookmarked certain parts that I really like. So no, to answer your question. What about you?
I have another.
What do you have? Okay, let's hear it.
Fairly an enablement book, but it is one that I go to time and time again. And it's the Sales Acceleration Formula by Mark Roberge. I go to this book also for inspiration. You know, he talks a lot about the sales process as a whole, hiring, what are the things that we should be looking at? And you might be thinking, well, that's not necessarily enablement, but there are certain elements that definitely touch on enablement. So this is another one that I keep on flicking through for inspiration, especially when I'm putting things together within the organization. Why? Because in a certain way, it's trial and tested. And I think Mark is such an inspirational thought leader in the industry that, you know, why wouldn't you go to something like this? So you're right, in terms of enablement books, pure hard copies. Yes, this is the only one that I have, but in terms of other books, you know, there are always things that we can learn.
Yeah, I like that. So let's say one of our listeners is like, okay, I'm going to write a charter, but I don't have this book yet, so I can't write the whole thing. Let's talk about the skeleton. What are like the main components of a charter that someone should include?
Yeah. So the first one is, who are you serving within the organization? Obviously, if you're looking after the entire commercial team, right, you have SDRs, you have AEs, you have customer success. Outline who it is that you're serving. And as you've mentioned, if it is a one-man shop, it's just you and enablement, right? You're not going to have the bandwidth to really work and make an impact with everyone. So prioritize, right? Who should we be having the vision for enablement? You know, what it is that we're aspiring to get to, the mission statement, right? How we're actually serving the organization. What are some of the key metrics, right? How are we going to know that enablement is successful? How are we going to know that we're actually making a difference? And there's a multitude of different metrics that you could be looking at, right? I think for anyone out there listening, you might be thinking, well, it's definitely correlated to revenue, right? And 100%, it has to be correlated for revenue to revenue. So I would say I would definitely start off with those 4 or 5 things that I mentioned. What would you add to it?
So you said mission and vision. I did objectives, which like specifically what will enablement achieve? Like if we were to look back at the end of the year, could we say we've done these things? And then the metrics, I think is super important. So I think you hit on the highlights.
With objectives, would you actually look at the entire year, or do you think it's important to look at objectives on a quarterly basis? Because obviously you might have objectives that are extremely ambitious, but before you're able to reach those objectives, you need to take smaller steps. So I'm not sure what your thoughts are, but mapping it out, Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, at the end of the year, we want to get here.
Yeah, so the answer for me is both. So what I did is I wrote objectives that I would like for at the end of the year, enablement's done these things. So like a couple of examples I put in were document all of our internal processes and find efficiencies to improve our speed to close. Another one was establish formalized onboarding and academy programs for basically our key roles within the revenue team. So those are like the big end of year. Did we do these things? Yes, we're successful. And then I broke it down by quarter. So for Q1 this year, I wanted organization of client-facing content. It's pretty simple. Develop an onboarding program for account executives was in Q2. We're still actually building that. Build a new hire metrics dashboard was something I wanted for Q3. Now that we're in Q4, I kind of need to look at these things and realize like, what else do we have to go to the end of the year? And then I even have a future state. Like you can't do everything in a year. Like there are a lot of enablement programs that take multiple years to really reach full maturity. And I recognize that that is going to be mine. And so one of them was hire an SDR enablement manager for, 2022 and beyond. I hired that earlier this year. So I actually built up my team this year, thinking I would do it over maybe a year or two, but we're growing so rapidly that you kind of need to accelerate some of the things from your future state. And some of the things that I've planned for, maybe we're just not quite ready for yet. So I might need to rearrange my charter as you go along. So to answer your question, I think you should have objectives for the full year that you should definitely revisit every quarter if they don't align with, where the company is at, but break it down by quarter as well, because that just goes down to project management. Like you got to have a big goal and then you got to break it up in order to make progress towards it.
Absolutely. And I think it goes back to this element of flexibility, right? All the examples that you're sharing now, like you're flexible, things change. You're able to hire and bring people on a lot quicker. There's nothing stopping you, nothing's in the way, and it's going to set you up for success in 2022. Amazing. And I think really being nimble, being flexible, being able to adjust and potentially change the steer a little bit throughout the course of the year is so important.
Yeah. So basically what I'm hearing us say is write a charter. It doesn't have to be super complex. It can be really simple. And just because you write a charter does not mean it is set in stone, put in a lockbox, throw away the key. You should always be evolving your charter as time goes on, especially if your business is in growth mode, rapid growth mode, hyper growth, whatever sort of growth lever you're at, you're going to need to revisit your charter more and more frequently, depending on how often your business changes. So the long and the short of it, I'm hearing is write a charter, just get started.
Just get started, right? And I feel like writing a charter is like, getting yourself motivated to go to the gym. Like once you're in there, you're doing it, right? You're picking up all the activities. And I feel it's the same thing with a charter. Once you start, even if it's a draft, even though it's not perfect, it's going to continue getting perfect because you've already done that first big step, which is always the scariest.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I think that does it for episode 3 of the Enablement Brew. So thank you everyone for joining us. We hope that you learned a little bit about the Enablement Charter. Malvina, what do you think we're going to talk about next?
Oh my gosh. I think potentially for the next episode, and I don't know what we wrote down for our list of topics, but I would love to talk about sales trainings.
Yes.
Who builds them out? Do you look at external providers? What are the trainings that Enablement should be putting together? And get your thoughts on that.
I think that sounds like a great topic. That sounds fun. All right. Episode 4, sales training. Is it Enablement's job? Whose job is it? We'll see you guys soon. Thank you for tuning in and have a great rest of your day.
Take care, guys. See you next
Bye.
time.